tomorrow it's the spring statement where the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will make what we think could be up to £15 billion of cuts from public spending, or is she going to borrow more? Are we going to see the return of austerity? How can you survive this dreaded spring statement?
Well, we're joined in the studio now by Shanker Singham, the CEO of Compter and the co-chair of the Growth Commission. Morning, Shanker.
Morning.
Why do I suspect that she isn't going to deliver what you might like in this spring statement tomorrow?
Well, we launched our own spring statement yesterday, and I think what we've basically said is, look, the UK is facing three big crises. There's a growth crisis, there's a fiscal crisis, and there's an exports crisis. And then there's actually a fourth crisis as well, which is underpinning all three of them, which is the cost of energy, which is 4 times what it is in the US. We're by far higher than any other developed country, and that underpins all these other crises. So we think, contrary to what we usually say in the Growth Commission, which is a sort of 10 or 20-year projection of how you generate some growth into the economy, we think emergency measures are now required, and we set out those on Monday.
Well, and how can there be any growth when, irrespective of what she says tomorrow, Shanker, the national insurance increase kicks in next month? £40 billion worth of tax cuts are kicking in next month. That can only suppress growth.
Yes, well, you make a good point, which is that I think sometimes there's a perception that growth is this sort of preordained thing, that we happen to have less growth now, so we have to cut and we have to do all these things. You know, growth comes because of policies that you actually choose, and we think you've got to start, first of all, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So we've recommended that certain things that are going to be suppressants to growth, like the employment rights bill, need to be scrapped. We think that's a huge cost to business and to economic growth.
Just remind people briefly what the employment rights.
So the employment, the UK we have a relatively flexible labour market, and that flexible labour market is crucial to GDP per capita growth. What makes it hard to fire people also makes it hard to hire them. If you're a small business, you can't hire anybody because you're afraid that you're not going to be able to, to fire them if they don't perform.
Yeah.
And for a small business, that could be existential. Yeah, so you have to maintain your flexible labour market. The employment rights bill goes in the other direction, makes it a lot less flexible, more like European labour markets, for example. And so you probably get European rates of growth if you do that. Our economic models show that that's a huge contributor to GDP per capita growth. So we think that has to change. And we think some emergency measures are needed. So planning reform, we agree with. We agree with the government on that. We think that they need to go a lot further than they're going. And I think, frankly, with a lot of these things, you need to repeal and replace the Town and Country Planning Act. Little changes around the edges of planning are not going to make it easier to build things and do stuff. On energy cost, we think you need a different approach to climate change. We think that you need to repeal the 2008 Climate Change Act. That is the reason why the costs of energy are so high. Again, you can tinker at the edges.
So abandon net zero?
Abandon net zero. I mean, I think there are many ways of dealing with climate change that are appropriate for a country that is making the UK contribution to the climate issue, which is to say very little.
Very little, yeah.
So therefore, there are lots of other things you can do. There's something called the Climate and Freedom Accord, which is an agreement amongst countries to incentivise the take-up of low-carbon energy production. There are lots of other things you can do. But the Climate Change Act of 2008 has set up for the 20 years, almost 20 years, it's set up a system which has contributed year on year to rising energy costs and energy prices, and you cannot be sustainable as a country. You cannot have a manufacturing sector that's competitive with the kinds of energy costs that we have. So you think you've got to change that.
And also
as
the pressures now that are baked into business plans to demonstrate that they are fulfilling their ESG agenda, environmental, social governance. It's so strangulating, isn't it, to companies, all of that bureaucracy. Do we have a massive correction coming, do you think, in this country? And is it going to be blamed on Trump?
Yeah, well, I think there is a massive correction coming, and I think, on April the 2nd, the agencies, USTR and other US agencies, will report to the president on unfair trade practices in other countries, and that report is going to be hundreds of pages, if not 1,000+ pages, of trade barriers in the G20. So that's basically the EU, UK, China, Japan, India, etc. And this is going to be a very big document. And the bigger your entry, the bigger your tariff is likely to be. And that is what's going to come at the UK on April the 2nd. And one of the things we did in the statement is we looked at a scenario where we do a trade deal with the US. In other words, we don't face these tariffs. We do as much as we can in the EU reset without giving away our regulatory autonomy, which is really, really important. And we improve our regulatory system by only 10%. We make it more competitive by about 10%. That is a net plus 6 or 7% of GDP. So that's a huge benefit to the UK. By contrast, if we have the 25% tariff, let's assume that's the figure that's been talked about. Let's assume there's something like a 25% tariff that the US applies to the UK. We lock into European regulation through what the government is talking about, a veterinary agreement with the EU on agricultural regulation. We then can't change our regulatory system. The cost of that is about minus, the effect of that is minus 6% of GDP. So the Chancellor is going to have a very straightforward exam question, which is, do you want +6 or -6? And that's the question that the Trump administration is going to pose, and we'll see how we respond.
I could sit talking to you all day, Shanker, because I think your insight is so fascinating, but Rachel Reeves making what appears to be mistake after mistake.
Yeah.
And I don't mean this from a party political point of view, and I think you're not even coming at it from a party political point of view, you're coming at it from an economics point of view. Is it inexperience? Is it deliberate? Is it lack of competence? What is making this government make so many decisions which are affecting the British people so badly?
Socialist dogma.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that the OBR and Treasury, and Treasury officials and so forth are setting up a false construct and a false constraint in which she is having to operate. Which is this is our projection for the fiscal, the headroom you have, Chancellor. This changes constantly, by the way. Multi-billion pounds changes, almost from day to day, because you can't predict this. It's a little bit of change in growth totally changes all these calculations. And I think the problem the Chancellor has is, instead of saying, we need to set out the policies and do the things that will actually grow the economy, and that will provide me the headroom that I need to do, the things that I need to do. And instead of sort of backing herself and saying, this is what we are going to do, she's allowing the OBR and others to sort of constantly say, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. If you can never do anything, then you're going to have a steady decline, which is what we've experienced. In June to January, we've had a 0.1% reduction in GDP. We've added in that time 600,000 plus people. So the GDP per capita impact, what people feel as household income, is less. It is minus 0.5. It's much, much lower. You just change that a little bit. You do, if that's plus 0.5, plus 1 as opposed to minus, the headroom changes completely.
And I think, like you say, Andrew, I think it is. It's just a socialist dogma. It's ideology over
tax.
Thank you, Shanker. Shanker Singham there, the co-chair of the Growth Commission. If people want to read your full report, is it online for them?
Absolutely. It's online at www.growth-commission.com.
Super. Right. Thank you so much. No doubt we'll talk to you after the spring statement.
Sure we will.
Tomorrow.